Human Services will come to order. Welcome, everyone. I note that a quorum is present. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on ending the cycle, examining ways to prevent domestic violence and promote healthy communities. I note for the subcommittee that full committee member Representative McBath of Georgia is joining us and is permitted to participate in today's hearing with the understanding that her questions will come after all members of the subcommittee on both sides of the aisle who are present have had an opportunity to question the witnesses. This is an entirely remote hearing. All microphones will be kept muted as a general rule to avoid unnecessary background noise. Members and witnesses will be responsible for unmuting themselves when they are recognized to speak or when they wish to seek recognition. I also ask that members please identify themselves before they speak. Members should keep their cameras on while in the proceeding. Members shall be considered present in the proceeding when they are visible on camera, and they shall be considered not present when they are not visible on camera. The only exception to this is if they are experiencing technical difficulty and inform committee staff of such difficulty. If any member experiences technical difficulties during the hearing, you should stay connected on the platform, make sure you are muted, and use your phone to immediately call the committee's IT director, whose number was provided in advance. Should the chair experience technical difficulty or need to step away to vote on the floor, which won't happen today, Chairman Scott or another majority member of the subcommittee, if he is not available, is hereby authorized to assume the gavel in the chair's absence. This is an entirely remote hearing, and as such, the committee's hearing room is officially closed. Members who choose to sit with their individual devices in the hearing room must wear headphones to avoid feedback, echoes, and distortion resulting from more than one person on the software platform sitting in the same room. Members are also expected to adhere to social distancing and safe health guidelines, including the use of masks, hand sanitizer, and wiping down their areas both before and after their presence in the hearing room. To make sure that the committee's 5-minute rule is adhered to, staff will be keeping track of time using the committee's field timer. The field timer will appear in its own thumbnail picture and will be labeled 001 timer. There will not be a 1-minute remaining warning. The field timer will sound its audio alarm when the time is up. Members and witnesses are asked to wrap up promptly when their time has expired. A roll call is not necessary to establish a quorum in official proceedings conducted remotely or with remote participation, but the committee has made it a practice whenever there is an official proceeding with remote participation for the clerk to call the roll to help make clear who is present at the start of the proceeding. Members should say their name before announcing they are present. This helps the clerk and also helps those watching the platform and the live stream who may experience a few seconds delay. At this time, I ask the clerk to call the roll.
Chair Bonamici?
Chair Bonamici is present.
Ms. Adams? Mrs. Hayes? Ms. Ledger-Fernandez?
Ms. Ledger-Fernandez is present.
Mr. Mervan?
Present. Frank Mervan, present.
Mr. Bowman?
Jamal Bowman, present.
Mr. Mfume? Ranking Member Fulcher?
Fulcher is here.
Mr. Thompson? Mrs. McLean? Mrs. Sparks? Mr. Fitzgerald?
I am here, present.
Chair Bonamici, that concludes the roll call.
Madam Chairman, I'm here too.
Alma Adams is present.
Thank you. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8C, opening statements are limited to the chair and the ranking member. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and provides all members with adequate time to ask questions. I recognize myself now for the purpose of making an opening statement. Today, we are discussing the urgent need to update and strengthen federal programs that help prevent intimate partner violence and provide services to survivors. Before I begin, I want to recognize that this discussion may be extremely difficult for some people who are watching. I would ask all participants to be mindful of the sensitive nature of this conversation. I encourage anyone who needs support to visit www.thehotline.org. This is an important and timely conversation. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has increased the risk for intimate partner violence and disrupted services that offer protection and support to survivors. As a result, an already quiet crisis has become even harder to both track and address. In Oregon, leaders like Vanessa Timmons, who the committee will hear from today, are working tirelessly to reach survivors and provide them with resources and support. In the district I represent here in Northwest Oregon, providers like the Domestic Violence Resource Center and Greater Portland YWCA provide shelter, support, services for children, and counseling for survivors in crisis. But we know they need more resources to meet the demand for assistance. The urgent need to address intimate partner violence cannot be overstated. About 1 in 4 women and nearly 1 in 10 men have reported experiencing some form of intimate partner violence. These incidents often cause physical injuries that portend even graver risks. Some reports have shown that more than half of female homicide victims were killed by an intimate partner. For survivors of violence, the emotional trauma can last long after the physical injuries have healed. These experiences often first occur when survivors are younger than 25, triggering potentially lifelong struggles with chronic disease and mental health conditions. Congress took a major step to address this issue in 1984 by authorizing the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. Today, this essential pillar in our fight against intimate partner violence is responsible for shelters, support services for survivors, and 24-hour domestic violence hotlines. With the passage of the Affordable Care Act in 2010, Congress also established the Pregnancy Assistance Fund, which provided critical services to improve the health of women and children. Specifically, this program invested in expanding access to services for teen parents as well as pregnant people and new parents who are survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault. These foundational programs are proven to be effective in addressing intimate partner violence, but they are also severely underfunded, particularly in light of today's challenges. Just a few weeks ago in the American Rescue American Rescue Plan, the committee secured $450 million for programs to address intimate partner violence and sexual assault. Importantly, this funding will help culturally specific organizations outreach to underserved communities of color, which have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. This historic investment in the American Rescue Plan will save lives, but we need long-term policies and investment. Now Congress must look to next steps, such as updating the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, which we have not reauthorized since 2003, and the Pregnancy Assistance Fund, which expired in 2019. Today, we'll discuss steps to further strengthen our response to the domestic violence crisis and, importantly, discuss ways that domestic violence and sexual violence can be prevented. First, we must focus on equity. Domestic violence can affect people from any background or income, but we know that communities of color, LGBTQ individuals, and people with disabilities face disproportionate rates of intimate partner violence, yet have limited access to services. We must further expand programs that are specifically designed to reach and support these underserved communities. We must also specifically invest in meeting the needs of Native survivors of domestic violence. We know tribal communities face unique barriers to navigating the healthcare and criminal justice systems, with only limited access to largely underfunded support services. Finally, and importantly, we must focus on preventing intimate partner violence before it happens. Currently, the only prevention program in the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act is significantly underfunded. Reauthorizing this law would help protect our communities from the pain and cost, emotionally, physically, and financially, of domestic violence. We can aggressively combat intimate partner violence and prevent it from happening in the first place. It's not only the smart thing to do as rates of violence increase, it's the right thing to do for the well-being of our families and communities. I thank my colleague, Representative Lucy McBath, for her leadership in working to reauthorize the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. And I also want to thank our witnesses for being with us. And I now yield to Ranking Member Mr. Fulcher for your opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for convening this hearing regarding domestic violence. A 2015 survey by the CDC estimated that 1/3 of all men and women are victims of domestic violence at some point in their life. Data in 2019 from my home state of Idaho supports this survey, whereby about 37% of assaults were domestic violence related. In 2020, it's worse. COVID-19 has dealt our nation with government mandated restrictions and economic challenges, and it appears those negative outcomes have snowballed to exacerbate an even worse fallout. Evidence suggests that in this pandemic-ridden environment, stress due to work, school, substance abuse, and financial struggles have added to more violence in the home. Especially hard hit appear to be rural areas where job opportunities can be hard to find. Last year, Idaho saw an 84% increase in domestic violence related calls, along with more emergency intakes and overnight shelter requests. Domestic violence in any form is an evil that demands a strong response. This issue does not impact all people equally. While a notable share of men are victimized, domestic violence disproportionately impacts women. And despite the cancel culture's desire to blur the lines between women and men, facts are facts. We need to protect everyone, but realize that our women are the most vulnerable. Congress has continued to allocate funding to address this issue, most recently in the CARES Act via Family Violence Prevention and Services programs, which I and many of my colleagues supported. Moving forward, our efforts should include confronting the issue and supporting survivors with tools like Domestic Violence Hotline, so victims can reach out and receive help. However, the solution is more complicated than simply increasing spending. More money alone will not solve domestic violence in our society. We must understand that dealing with this issue is best done at the local level, and government cannot always provide the answers. Local civic groups and faith-based providers are best positioned to provide aid and deliver it effectively. Committee Republicans recognize the importance of supporting survivors of domestic violence, but any reauthorization should focus primarily on local solutions and a coordinated community response, not just more federal spending. The committee should work to support best practices and act knowing that as good as our intentions may be, we cannot pretend to be able to solve them all from Washington, D.C. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, especially Ms. Amy Navratia, I'll get that straight, who will discuss the important work of local organizations and faith-based providers are doing to serve those in need. Madam Chair, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Fulcher. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. on April 5th of 2021. I will now introduce the witnesses. Mrs. Vanessa Timmons is the Executive Director of the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. Ms. Wendy Schneider is the Vice Chairwoman of the La Jolla Band of Luiseño Indians. She is Board Treasurer of the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. Ms. Amy Novarita is the Chief Program Officer for Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Chicago, and Dr. Elizabeth Miller is a pediatrician and Director of Adolescent and Young Adult Medicine at UPMC Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh. We appreciate the witnesses for participating today, and we look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we have read your written statements and they will appear in full in the hearing record. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8D and committee practice, you are each asked to limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. I also remind witnesses that pursuant to Title 18 of the U.S. Code Section 1001, it is illegal to knowingly and willfully falsify any statement, representation, writing, document, or material fact presented to Congress or otherwise conceal or cover up a material fact. And before you begin your testimony, please remember to unmute your microphone. During your testimony, staff will be keeping track of time and a timer will sound when your time is up. Please be attentive to the time and wrap up when your time is over and then remute your microphone. If you experience any technical difficulties during your testimony or later in the hearing, you should stay connected on the platform, make sure you're muted, and use your phone to immediately call the committee's IT director whose number was provided to you in advance. We will let all the witnesses make their presentations before we move to member questions. When answering a question, please remember to unmute your microphone. I will first recognize Mrs. Timmons. You are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bonamici, Ranking Member Fulcher, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on ending the cycle, examining ways to prevent domestic violence and promote healthy communities. My name is Vanessa Timmons. I'm the Executive Director of the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. I've been in the field for more than 30 years, and I've been the OCADSFA Executive Director for the past 8 years. I hope to speak on behalf of not only our 51 member programs in Oregon, but also on behalf of survivors that we all serve. Unfortunately, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men are survivors of domestic violence. This means all of us know someone who's been impacted by intimate partner violence. No one in our country escapes the impact of this public health crisis. Intimate partner violence is a public health issue, which requires all of us and a holistic public health response. Over 1,600 domestic violence programs offer services such as emergency shelter, counseling, legal assistance, and preventative education to millions of adult and child victims every year. These programs rely on the consistent funding provided by the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, also referred to as FVPSA. FVPSA expired in 2015 and must be reauthorized with key enhancements in order to meet the intersecting crisis of this moment. Since its passage in 1984, FVPSA has remained the sole federal funding source for domestic violence shelters and services. FVPSA is the lifeblood of domestic violence programs, providing stable, modest funding. FVPSA also provides dedicated funding to domestic violence coalitions in every state and U.S. territory. Coalitions provide support, technical assistance, and training to our local programs who support the survivors that we all care so deeply about. Coalitions are important because we bring that bird's eye view to the field while programs are doing their day-to-day work. We work closely with our state government agencies to ensure funding is getting to each and every community. Despite the progress brought by FVPSA, programs are underfunded and we struggle to keep up with demand for services. According to the National Network to End Domestic Violence's forthcoming Domestic Violence Counts report, in 2020, domestic violence programs across the country served more than 76,000 victims just in one day. But sadly, in that same day, over 11,000 requests for services went unmet due to a lack of resources. Approximately 57% of these unmet requests were for housing and emergency shelter. For those individuals who were not able to find safety that day, the consequences could be dire. The COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately affected victims of domestic violence and exacerbated their urgent needs. Stay-at-home orders, quarantines, and the lack of privacy that is inherent in an abusive home has created additional barriers to safety and access to services. Black, Indigenous, and other survivors of color have always faced increased barriers to safety, such as systemic racism and historical trauma. The pandemic has heightened the need for culturally specific organizations who are better equipped to address the complex challenges facing victims from racial and ethnic minority populations. The reauthorization of FIPSA provides an important opportunity to continue the progress we have made toward meeting the needs of domestic violence victims and breaking that terrible cycle of abuse. Victims' needs are great, and there's much to do to end domestic violence in our country. In order to move closer to this goal, I urge the committee to prioritize the swift reauthorization of the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Timmons, for your testimony. And now we recognize, I will recognize Ms. Schneider for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Hello, and thank you, Chairwoman Bonamici, Ranking Member Fulcher, and committee members. My name is Wendy Schneider. I am the Vice Chairwoman for the La Jolla Band of Listeño Indians. The Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, FIPSA, has made a difference in the lives of victims of domestic violence. FIPSA reauthorization with the enhancements will ensure the door to life-saving services for all victims remains open. I urge this committee to support reauthorization with the proposed enhancements. The 2018 Commission Civil Rights Broken Promises report found that the federal government's failure to fulfill its trust responsibility is at the root of inequities facing Native Americans in health, public safety, and housing. I am also the director of the Safety for Native Women's program funded by FIPSA, responding to violence against women. We provide 24/7 crisis services, shelter, counseling, and other assistance. Our FIPSA funding fills in the gaps that victims otherwise fall through. One of those gaps is the justice system, which often fails victims. For these victims, FIPSA resources are all that's preventing them from going missing or being murdered. Your support for FIPSA enhances is key to tackling these problems. Only with FIPSA funding can we provide shelter through hotel rooms, safe homes, and shelters, and a shelter that we opened, which is often full. We also help children who are removed from their homes, placing them with other family. Without these resources, our children are placed in a local children's center, which we avoid using because they have been further victimized in this center. While FIPSA reauthorization expired in 2015, appropriators have set aside increased funds from 2017 to 2021 for an Alaska Native Resource Center to reduce tribal disparities, for a National Indian Domestic Violence Hotline, and tribal grant programs. The proposed reauthorization enhancements permanently authorize these changes made by appropriators. Authorization for an Alaska Native Resource Center and Indian Domestic Violence Hotline increased overall authorizations, and adjustments of the formula increased what tribes receive from 10 to 12.5%. I know firsthand how FIPSA has made a difference. One morning when I arrived at my office, a woman and her children were parked in the front of our office and had spent the night there. The woman had run away the night before with her children, one of whom was autistic and had Down syndrome. She left with nothing because her husband had been abusive and burned their clothes, including their son's orthotic brace, which he needed to walk. Through FIPSA, we replaced the son's orthotic brace, found her temporary shelter, and later a home of her own. The National Domestic Violence Hotline launched a National Indian Hotline, Strong Hearts. Native advocates help navigate the barriers facing Native victims, despite the rates of violence against Native women. Native services are thin. Where the National Hotline has more than 4,000 resources in their database, Strong Hearts has fewer than 300 Native resources. There are more than 1,500 shelters nationwide compared to fewer than 60 Native shelters, hence the proposed authorization for National Indian Hotline. Tribal coalitions have been key to educating policymakers. Examples of this resulting changes include the local shelter that we've opened and the states that have established missing and murdered Indigenous women's task forces. The technical assistance by coalitions has been at the heart of these changes. Unfortunately, tribal coalitions are not authorized to receive FIPSA funding. This exclusion reflects a disparity faced by tribal coalitions and the tribes they serve. One of the proposed FIPSA enhancements is authorizing funding for tribal coalitions. In 2013, the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center developed the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, which helped to raise challenges facing Alaska Native victims as issues of national concern. As a result, in 2017, Congress appropriated funds for the Alaska Native Resource Center, which has been an invaluable resource providing information to prevent domestic violence like never before. In addition, we have coordinated with the Native Hawaiians to address domestic violence, helping to create a grassroots organization with over 50 years of advocacy experience. The 1993 apology to Hawaiians recognized the economic and social changes over the centuries have been devastating to the health and well-being of the Hawaiian people. Congress amended FIPSA in 2010, authorizing Native resource centers, including Native Hawaiian Center, which could help promote healthier communities. In closing, the federal government must fulfill its trust responsibility to assist tribes and Native Hawaiians in safeguarding women. Failing to do so results in Native women experiencing disproportionate rates of violence. I urge the committee to reauthorize FIPSA with the proposed enhancements. Nashon Lovek, my heart is good. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. And I will now recognize Ms. Novarita for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chair Bonamici, Ranking Member Fulcher, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify on how Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Chicago strives to prevent domestic violence and promote healthy communities. Catholic Charities is one of the largest social service providers in the Midwest, and I am here today as Charities Chief Program Officer. For 104 years, Catholic Charities has served and accompanied anyone in need in Greater Chicago. Every year, Charities helps nearly 200 survivors of domestic violence and those at high risk through emergency shelter, safety planning, counseling, legal services, and transitional housing. Our wraparound services and our partnerships help survivors and in many cases their children improve stability and restore security. The survivors that we serve at Catholic Charities Chicago face staggering challenges. 100% live below the federal poverty line. They come to us as survivors of intergenerational trauma. They fear losing their children. They often have prolonged exposure to substance abuse and are experiencing homelessness or unstably housed. Almost universally, they are in poor physical and emotional health. Survivors are often isolated due to cultural factors, language barriers, and lack of awareness of their lawful protections. Moreover, they have inadequate support once they leave the abusive situation. It is often the church and Catholic Charities to which survivors turn. The role of trusted, faith-based providers in this service arena is profound. We are finding that COVID only compounds the struggles faced by the survivors we serve. Since the pandemic began, the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline reports a 15% increase in calls and a 2,000% increase in text messages requesting help. Additional burdens include financial stress, unemployment, isolation, increased family conflict, and deepening mental health issues. For persons experiencing domestic abuse, lockdowns and other COVID restrictions have forced them to spend more time with their survivor, more time with their abuser, and less time with their support networks, increasing survivors' difficulty trying to flee. A grim reality is that flight from an abusive situation often leaves survivors without a place to call home. In response, Catholic Charities operates 2 transitional housing programs for domestic violence survivors. While families are in a safe environment, Charities supports them on their journey toward healing and recovery with a long-term goal of securing permanent housing and stable employment. We offer free legal services, including facilitating orders of protection and court representation. Although survivors may reside with us for up to 2 years, families typically transition after 12 to 14 months. Once a 1-year housing agreement is secured, Charities arranges for the family to move into its new home. With our support, survivors arrive with a truckload of furniture, household supplies and clothing, and often with savings of $2,000 to $3,000. Most important is their increased self-sufficiency and their deep connection to a supportive, faith-based community. Our presence continues in many survivors' lives through aftercare programming, including support groups and access to food, clothing, school supplies, and other necessities. Even through COVID, 100% of the survivors that we have served remain in stable, permanent housing. Prior to COVID, 68% sustained full-time employment. Today, employment is an ongoing struggle. This winter, we began offering new services for survivors of domestic violence on the west side of Chicago, where African American and Latinx communities have been hardest hit by COVID. Our staff offer trauma-informed counseling and intensive case management. We are collaborating with churches, hospitals, and others to expand access to free, confidential services for survivors. Together, we are helping people regain control of their lives and continue their healing process. Our shelters and our healing recovery programs help survivors to rebuild their lives with hope and dignity. Thank you for this opportunity to lift up our work before you today.
Thank you for your testimony. And finally, we will hear from Dr. Miller. I recognize you for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bonamici, Ranking Member Fulcher, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today on the importance of preventing domestic violence and child abuse and reauthorizing the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, FVPSA. My name is Dr. Liz Miller. I'm a professor of pediatrics and public health at the University of Pittsburgh. I also direct adolescent and young adult health and community health at UPMC Children's Hospital. I'm here today to share with you some of my personal reflections over the last 20 years working as a pediatrician and researcher. And I begin with a story from 2 decades ago while I was still a physician in training. I was volunteering one night a week in a clinic for young people who were unstably housed. A 15-year-old came in for a pregnancy test. She didn't want to be pregnant and was not using any contraception. Her pregnancy test was negative. I offered her education. Along the way, I asked her the usual domestic violence screening question I'd been taught to ask. Are you feeling safe in your relationship? To which she nodded a quick yes. I finished with her exam, gave her some health information, and encouraged her to come back if she wanted help preventing pregnancy. 2 weeks later, she was in our emergency room with a severe head injury, having been pushed down the stairs by her boyfriend. That experience fundamentally shifted my career. I dedicated myself to understanding more about the impact of violence on young people. With opportunities created by FVPSA, I have been able to provide some of the evidence that we can indeed prevent violence. For this testimony, I'm going to focus on 2 evidence-based programs. One, in partnership with the National Health Resource Center on Domestic Violence, run by Futures Without Violence, a FVPSA grantee, I co-created an intervention for healthcare settings that can reduce rates of violence. This approach, which we call CUES, C for confidentiality, U for universal education, E for empowerment, and S for support, has been shown in several randomized trials to be effective. A second program I'd like to lift up is called Coaching Boys into Men. This violence prevention program inspires athletic coaches to teach their young athletes about healthy and respectful relationships. In randomized trials with both high school and middle school athletes, the program has found dramatic reductions in relationship abuse and sexual violence 1 year later. In fact, our team recently published an estimate that for every 1,000 boys exposed to this program, 20 cases of sexual assault are prevented. Given that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, estimates one sexual assault costs our society about $123,000, the return on investment of a program like this is immense. I strongly recommend the reauthorization of FVPSA. While the FVPSA program is administered by Family and Youth Services Bureau within the larger Administration for Children and Families, it is the Delta program administered by the CDC and authorized as part of FVPSA that focuses on prevention. The Coaching Boys into Men program I mentioned has been implemented across the country using Delta funding, and Delta extends only to about 10 states each year. So I recommend that we continue to fund state and local partnerships via the Delta program to test new and innovative ideas for prevention. Second, to provide baseline funding so all of our states and territories may have designated funding for prevention. And finally, to provide additional designated funding to the Family Violence Prevention and Services program within Family and Youth Services Bureau so that our victim service agencies can also support prevention activities. I also want to go back for a moment to the story I mentioned at the outset. Although my patient was not pregnant that day, she could have been among our young people who are pregnant and parenting. The Pregnancy Assistance Fund previously played a vital role in helping this most vulnerable group. Young people who are pregnant and parenting need extra support to succeed. High quality childcare, education, housing, food security, transportation, and certainly comprehensive health care. So I will leave you with 3 thoughts. Violence is preventable. Second, to prevent domestic violence and child abuse, We must take a holistic approach. And finally, FIPSA is an excellent federal program. We know it works. Rarely have so few dollars accomplished so much to help people. And we can do more to support prevention. First, by expanding the Delta program so funding can reach all states. And second, by authorizing additional prevention funding out of the Family Violence and Services Office. Thank you for the honor and privilege of sharing these thoughts with you today and for your consideration. I'm now ready to take your questions as well.
Thank you so much, each of you, for your excellent testimony. Under Committee Rule 9A, we will now question witnesses under the 5-minute rule. After the chair and ranking member, I will be recognizing members in the order of their seniority on the full committee. And again, to adhere to the members' 5-minute rule, staff will be keeping track of time, and a timer will sound when your time is over. Please remute your microphone. As chair, I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mrs. Timmons, thank you so much for your work and commitment to helping survivors in Oregon. I'm impressed by everything you've accomplished over the years. I learned a lot from our conversation last week. Recently, Congress provided $450 million to support survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual assault during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I wanted to ask you, could you please tell us more about the operational challenges that programs in Oregon have experienced during the pandemic and during maybe prior disasters that have made supplemental funds so critical?
Thank you. The survivors in Oregon really struggled early on to get the proper PPE or proper equipment to keep our shelters open and keep survivors safe while they were in shelter. We struggled significantly with getting masks and cleaning supplies, and shelters in our state are small. They're primarily homes that have been transferred into shelters. And so this was a significant barrier to safety. We also had fires that raged through our community, which caused some shelters to have to close and move survivors into hotels. We were struggling with really basic needs at that point, from food to water to clothing and some of the really basic things that folks needed. One of the things that I also want to touch on in terms of COVID is the disproportionate impact that COVID has had on tribal and BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities in Oregon. And I think that there's been a significant impact to advocates in those communities who are doing that work. We saw reductions in volunteers. We saw reductions in advocates being able to do the work that they need to do as they're taking care of their elders, taking care of their children, while also trying to keep survivors safe. We also had to pull all of our sexual assault advocates that were doing accompaniment to hospitals out of the hospitals and find alternative methods to do sexual assault advocacy. So the COVID-19 impact has just been incredibly broad. But
I don't want to cut you off, but I want to get a couple more questions.
Please do.
That's very, very helpful.
Cut me off anytime.
I just wanted to recognize Ms. Novarita. You mentioned some of the same things in your testimony too about the challenges during COVID. I want to ask Vice Chairwoman Schneider. We know that the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, administered, as we know, by Department of Health and Human Services, approaches intimate partner violence from a public health perspective. And why is the public health approach so important for Native survivors? And what are some of the barriers that Native survivors face in getting assistance from places, for example, the criminal justice system?
Yeah, thank you, Chairwoman. I'll get back with you more in detail in writing on that question. But you know, the answer that comes off the top of my mind right now is jurisdictional issues, and you know, who has jurisdiction over the incident, especially in a public law 280 state like California. Right. And so it's really hard sometimes to even get a response from the justice system.
Thank you. Well, I look forward to finding out more about that. And Dr. Miller, I'm concerned because during the pandemic, pregnant women of color, for example, have sometimes delayed or reduced prenatal care visits, and that has exacerbated complications. We already have the complexities of the national maternal mortality crisis. So why is it so important for, especially for survivors of color, to continue to receive healthcare and social services that are provided by the Pregnancy Assistance Fund grants?
Thank you, Chairwoman Bonamici, for that question. The maternal mortality is something that's deeply personal for me. Here in Pittsburgh, we recently did a study where we rank the third percentile, so 97% of other comparable cities across the country look better than us on maternal mortality. So we have been deeply, deeply engaged in this issue. And it is certainly complex, but the solutions lie in having really consistent and trustworthy health and social services. And the Pregnancy Assistance Fund is absolutely vital to that in terms of providing the social services and supports that are needed and getting to those who are experiencing the greatest fear and marginalization.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to set a good example, and because the clock is now at 0, I'm going to yield back and recognize Ranking Member Fulcher for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and you certainly do set a good example. I've got my stop clock going. This question is for Ms. Novarita. I got your name correct, I think, this time. Forgive me. But I appreciate that you shared the value of faith-based organizations in serving survivors in this issue. Any objective review of history reveals that faith was a critical part of our founders and fundamentally important part of life in America. I know I've seen firsthand in my own life the importance of the church in helping to meet the needs of the local community. Can you share a little bit more about why it's important for the faith community to be involved with this issue?
Sure. Thank you, Representative Fulcher. Due to the trust factor, many people go to their minister, clergy, staff at faith-based providers like Catholic Charities and others when they need help, whether it be for domestic violence, other sources of distress. Similarly, what we're finding is that providing services at or in connection with the church, temple, parish helps the survivor feel safe. As has been shared today, isolation and control are very common in domestic violence relationships, and often the church or another faith-based institution is a place that an abuser will allow their partner to go alone. I think it's important to say too that for many faiths, believers may feel that they cannot leave an abusive relationship because they have taken a religious vow or sacrament or the sacred ritual of marriage. It is empowering for them to hear from their minister, clergy, or counselor connected to the faith that they are not expected to stay and endure the abuse.
Thank you. And if I could just do a follow-up to that. I'm not Catholic, I'm evangelical Christian, so I don't necessarily understand the inner workings of Catholic Charities. But what I do know is the positive impact that your efforts have had, and those appear to be undeniable. So this question is basically, how do you do it, in the sense of you must do some partnering in local communities, and how do you do it? How does it work?
So survivors are often dependent on their abusers in multiple ways: financially, emotionally, socially. As Rachel Louise Schneider shared in her 2019 book, No Visible Bruises, domestic violence that's adjacent to so many other problems that we as a society grapple with: education, economics, mental and physical health, crime, gender, racial equality, and more. And so what we know is that the protection and safety of survivors requires both policies and systems and partnerships that recognize that domestic violence is a public health crisis with enormous implications for public safety, homelessness, and economic insecurity. So in our work with survivors, we know that an array of services and a coordinated approach is necessary. We partner with other local trusted service providers, including local hospitals, the Women's Mental Health Program at Cook County Jail, the Network Advocating Against Domestic Violence, and others that offer job development, housing, and legal services. What we do know is none of us can do this work alone. And so together we wrap services around the survivor so that they can both become more self-sufficient and also feel part of a broader supportive network.
And thank you for that. And we've only got a little bit over a minute, so this will need to be a little bit quicker. But how are you funded? How do you keep the lights on and the services going?
Yep. So like everybody else has shared here, funding from the government for domestic violence services is limited. And so we combine both a combination of federal and state funding as well as significant private donations from the local community.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Novarita, for what you do and your testimony. To the rest of our panel as well. Thank you so much. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Fulcher. I now recognize Representative Adams from North Carolina for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to pull over and ask my questions. Thank you to all of the witnesses for your testimony. African American women experience intimate partner violence at a rate of about 35% higher than their white counterparts. However, they're less likely to use social services and seek out medical treatment for intimate partner violence. Ms. Timmons, what are some of the unique and systemic barriers women in Black communities face in accessing support services?
Thank you. African American survivors are definitely face significant barriers to accessing services. I think the most significant barrier that I have personally noticed when working with Black women is the barrier around finding services that they can trust and that they feel are responsive to the unique and culturally specific needs of their community, of their children, and of their families. And so that's the biggest barrier, is looking for that culturally specific response that they feel they can really trust and get the unique, their unique needs met.
Okay, what role does the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black community play in ensuring that victims in the community are connected with the appropriate resources?
Play a significant role. The biggest role I think that they play for us in Oregon is making sure we have access to adequate information about the disparities in the Black community, allowing us to understand where those gaps really are and what are the best practices in responding to those gaps and those needs.
Thank you very much. So we know that many people in our country do not feel comfortable calling the police when they need help. Vice Chairwoman Schneider and Ms. Timmons, can you talk more about what happens when victims don't feel safe calling the police, and what other resources can they turn to, and why these funding services are so important in these cases?
And,
That's for Vice Chairwoman Schneider and Ms. Timmons.
Okay, thank you, Congresswoman Adams. So basically, without our program here, it was very before these type of funds came into our community, it was very unsafe on our reservations because there was no accountability for offenders and somewhat hopelessness. And with tribal government's hands tied by jurisdiction issues, you know, it was like if you called the sheriffs for a domestic violence call, you'd get an 8-hour response or no response at all. And that in turn led to more abuse for the victim who made the call for help, right? And so there have been incidences in our community where families have tried to intervene with, you know, beating up the victim's perpetrator. But that hasn't resulted in anything healthy. That wasn't a good solution for that. So with our program and our services, we've been able to build relationships with local law enforcement, build our own tribal law enforcement program as well, and then really establish a life-saving link between the victim when they pick up the call to make for help there. And so Ms. Timmons?
Thank you. I think that nothing, pardon? I think that nothing points, I think one of the things that we've absolutely learned about domestic violence is one size does not fit all, right? We can build wonderful, vigorous, culturally responsive responses to the multiple complicated issue of domestic and sexual violence. This is not something that we can create simple answers to. And I think that when it comes to law enforcement, there's absolutely a role that they play, an important role in keeping us all safe from domestic and sexual violence, but it's everyone's issue. And our whole community has to respond to it in vigorous and responsive ways, from educating family members on best practices and how to respond, to educating healthcare workers, to educating clergy, to educating our communities and neighbors. And so I think that when I think about, that law enforcement response, I think it's been a wonderful tool for many survivors, but when people are afraid to call law enforcement, they have to have just as strong and just as wonderful a tool in their toolbox as well. So we have to move beyond one size fits all and really respond to the needs that survivors are bringing us each and every day.
Great. Thank you both very much, Madam Chair. I'm going to yield back.
Thank you, Representative. I now recognize Representative Fitzgerald from Wisconsin for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to kind of go back to one of the things that Ranking Member Fulcher had mentioned, and it's, I think, because of my knowledge of what goes on in the Milwaukee Archdiocese. And Catholic Charities, I know, I'm just wondering overall kind of the financial picture, because I know that many individual parishes that work with some of the non-denominational outlets that many women can reach out to. And the one that I'm very familiar with, it's in my congressional district. It's called PAVE, People Against a Violent Environment. And I know that there's some there's issues, kind of across the spectrum on funding as a result of some of the parishes struggling, who oftentimes set aside dollars for many of the programs related to the Archdiocese and to charities. So whether it's Milwaukee Archdiocese Charities or Chicago Charities, I'm just wondering if you can kind of comment on that, Ms. Novoraita. Hope I said that right. Sorry.
You're close.
Okay.
It's Novarita. It's Novarita.
Okay.
Yes, I mean, to build on kind of what I think has been shared pretty universally across the comments today, funding for survivors of domestic violence, who are 95% of survivors in Illinois are women, is insufficient. And that is true at Catholic Charities of Chicago as well. And I think that speaks to both the need for federal dollars to come into local jurisdictions more frequently and at a more significant level. How we have in Chicago, how we have been able to continue these programs is, I think, in two ways. First, it's through leaning on folks within our community to support the work that we're doing financially. And second, it's, as I spoke to earlier, we have significant partnerships outside Catholic Charities. I think the other thing that might be important to mention is that within Catholic Charities of Chicago, so as a large organization, we serve about 400,000 people every year across a variety of services, and particularly through federal funding and other resources, we have housing programs, including transitional housing, permanent housing, other wraparound services as it relates to counseling, trauma-informed therapy, excuse me, so on and so forth. And so our staff have become very solution-oriented in kind of bringing the puzzle pieces they need together from different funding sources in different parts of the organization in order to provide services.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, I know there's a series of challenges, obviously, and appreciate your testimony and you being here today. And I would yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzgerald. I now recognize Representative Hayes from Connecticut for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us on this important hearing. In my state of Connecticut, I've seen them struggle to combat the surge of domestic violence during this pandemic. We've seen at our domestic violence shelters 150% increase in capacity, and calls for help have increased by 71%. But even before we reached this point, I saw my students in the classroom who were suffering with the long-term ripple effects of family violence. In Congress, I've advocated for the need for trauma-informed care for students to help address the growing mental health crisis that they face. I actually have a bill, the Supporting Trauma-Informed Education Practices Act, that I've been working to get support on because I know how critically important it is. Family violence prevention and support funds would also be good, and support of the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health is important, especially now. So my question today is for Ms. Timmons. Could you please speak to the importance of incorporating trauma-informed care into our response to victims of intimate partner violence?
Thank you. Trauma-informed care and trauma-informed responses are really how, I believe, are really how we're going to see ourselves through the domestic violence crisis and to the other side. I feel as if without trauma-informed responses, it's very difficult to break the cycle of violence. Trauma affects us in our whole bodies. It affects how we parent. It affects how we navigate our own healing, how we're able to access our own resources. So I really do feel like trauma-informed care is central to the work that we're doing. Everything that we've learned about trauma and how to apply it to our healing our families, our organizations, and our communities has brought us closer and closer to really ending this terrible epidemic of violence that we've been faced with.
Thank you. There's another component of that. Like I said, I was a classroom teacher for many, many years, and I saw family violence the impact of family violence up close, but also dating violence. Many young people get involved with dating violence very early on, and in turn, they are adults with the highest rates of interpersonal violence. Can you speak to what schools can do to help reduce domestic and family violence and promote safe and healthy relationships?
Yeah, education. I think that prevention is key to breaking the cycle of violence. We have to be able to teach our young people what consent is, what violence is, and what healthy relationships are. So I think that's really, really important.
Thank you. My last question, nearly 20 years ago, Congress authorized special grants under the Family Violence Prevention and Support Act. Dr. Miller, can you speak to the importance of a multi-general approach, particularly when as it relates to these types of relationships we've seen, as we've heard before, where multi-generations deal with this type of violence? What can we do in Congress?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for bringing the focus back to prevention as well, because while FIPSA is about services and supporting our victim service agencies to do the work of supporting our survivors with the trauma-sensitive responses that Ms. Timmons was just speaking to, it is also absolutely critical that we invest in prevention. And prevention includes recognizing that we need to support more adult allies and peers, right? So to Ms. Timmons' point, education, integrating dating violence prevention, but more broadly, trauma-sensitive school practices, as you're talking about, Congresswoman Hayes, into our K through 12 schools. That also includes, however, from the 0 to 5 kind of, kindergarten readiness, that thinking about positive parenting strategies, creating this sort of audacious hope, right, that positive parenting is possible in that context of recognizing that healing and recovery is possible. Our families are not broken. Our communities are not broken. We need to come together. As Representative Fulcher was saying, this is local, because indeed it is a local response of creating a collective from our faith-based collaboratives, our schools, our community organizations, and the vital importance of our victim service advocates who create a community of care.
Thank you so much. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you so much. We now have the ranking member of the full committee, Ranking Member Fox. I recognize you for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. My question's for Ms. Navarrete. What has been the biggest impact of COVID on your programs that work to address the problems of domestic violence? Have you seen any change in outreach through your parish as society has started to open more recently?
Yes, we're finding that many victims of domestic violence are reaching out to Catholic Charities for other immediate needs because they've lost their job, they might need financial assistance to stay in their home, they need food. And when our staff are able to meet that need and begin building a relationship with that individual, we begin to learn more about other struggles, including with domestic violence. In many of the communities that we serve, stores are closed, houses of worship are not open, schools, community centers are closed, and we're finding that we need to really meet people where they are. And over the last year, that has been at hospitals. And so similar to what Dr. Miller has been sharing, we've been working with local hospitals to train physicians, their social workers, their case managers, to screen patients for other social determinants of health and also for domestic violence. They then are referring their patients to Catholic Charities. We're also finding that we need to be more flexible. And I think this is one of those millions of trends that started during COVID and are going to continue. Lack of privacy is a huge barrier to counseling. The 45-minute sessions that have been our standard of care is rare. Instead, our trauma-informed counselors are connecting with survivors more frequently, often via text messages and short phone calls. We are responding to spontaneous calls, and we're doing more regular safety checks. It's more difficult for survivors to get time alone, and so we're coaching them on ways to do this. Sometimes that means locking yourself in the bathroom. That means going for a walk with your phone. That means sitting in your car. I think another thing to note in this conversation is that the survivors that we work with, who again, 100% are below the federal poverty line, do not always have access to Zoom, which is bringing us here today. And this is particularly challenging because during COVID, survivors have been expected to participate in court via Zoom. And so we now have mobile telehealth cards at 10 of our sites across Greater Chicago, in part so that survivors have a safe, private place to access and attend court on behalf of themselves and often their children as well.
Well, thank you. That was such a thoroughly good answer. I had a bit of a follow-up to that, but you've done such a fantastic job of answering the question. My follow-up is related to it. It was, as you've described, how you're able to work with other groups through your provision of services like food, childcare, legal services in-house, which has allowed you, as you've described, to be more effective in identifying the people who need services for domestic violence. I think you've done a very, very good job of that. I want to thank you and everyone involved with Catholic Charities for stepping up to do what you do, what you've done for generations of people. It's fantastic. Because I've had to split, I've gone from one hearing to another today. I don't know if there was any opportunity, or if you were denied any opportunity to make comments on something someone else said or to finish up an answer. Do you have, I think I have a little time left. Do you have anything else you want to add to the discussion?
I will add, I want to build on what Vanessa Timmons was sharing about the importance of trauma-informed counseling. And briefly, last August, we began working with a mother and her 5-year-old daughter. And our trauma-informed therapist met with this child after she spent the morning clutching the hands of her mother as she lay recovering in critical care after her husband nearly beat her to death. And that little girl spent the night crying, "Mommy, mommy, mommy." She told our therapist that she wanted her mom to hear her voice before God took her away from her. The survivors and the families that we serve, I'll be brief, have suffered and continue to suffer from trauma, and professional counselors with the credentials, trauma-informed expertise, and experience are just essential to our work, not only with the adults, but the children.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Fox, and no worries about going over on that. I think that was a very compelling story that we all benefit from hearing, tragic as it may be. Next, I recognize Representative Ledger Fernandez for 5 minutes for your question.
Thank you, Chair Bonamici, and thank you to all our witnesses for joining us today and for evoking the response of a tear in the eye over these stories, right? But I think we need to make sure that we take these stories, heartbreaking as they are, and take them as our call to action. I will say I've worked with Catholic Charities over many decades in their excellent work with immigrants who've been welcomed and supported by Catholic Charities regardless of their status. And I've always appreciated that of them. And Ms. Navarrete, thank you for detailing the work you've done with survivors and making it come home. Dr. Miller, thank you for your audacious hope that it is possible to prevent violence and break the cycle. I want to address my first questions to Vice Chairwoman Schneider. Your testimony did highlight that American Indian and Alaska Native women experience higher rates of violence than any other race or ethnicity, about close to 50%. And then there are the fact that there are fewer shelter and programs, that we need to support coalitions, especially given this jurisdictional issue. I completely agree with you that we are failing in our trust obligations and must do more. So, Ms. Vice Chairwoman, could you please share what you believe Congress should focus on to better protect Native women, both in the reauthorization of the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, and if you believe we should do more in some other area as well for protecting our sisters?
Thank you, Congresswoman Fernandez. Yeah, so the enhancements that we're proposing in this reauthorization of FIPSA are very critical for the tribal program increase, tribal grants increase from 10 to 12.5%. The funding, the dedicated funding for a national Indigenous Indian domestic violence hotline, the direct funding for the Alaska Native Resource Center, and lastly, for our Hawaiian Native sisters as well. They've been, neglected, over the decades by the federal government as well. And so for their resource center as well, on Congresswoman Hayes's comments on informed trauma care, we need more funding dedicated towards that as well, because we know that the solutions lie within the tribal teachings of our people in our language. And when we do cultural activities with our youth, and then when we do peer counseling with the women and the men that we service, and we go back to our stories and our teachings, it gives great comfort, and it also gives an examples on how to be a good relative, right? And so for like our young boys group that we work with, you talk about prevention. We teach our boys rattling. And so to hold a rattle is sacred for our songs. And so if you're holding a rattle that is sacred, then you don't hurt anybody with your hands. And if you're singing those songs, you don't hurt anybody with your words, right? And so, there's a whole teaching that goes into the rattle as well, and it deals with like consent and asking for the rattle to be put together, and representing the seeds inside the rattle, representing the family. And so those are beautiful teachings that we work with our youth. And for the young girls group, we do singing and dancing as well. And so we talk about the regalia that they wear, and that the honor that it is that some of the family members make their pieces of regalia that they put on, and so that they in return, are to take care of themselves first, because they're sacred life givers. And then if women are given everything that they need to be taken care of, they in return will take care of the whole village. That includes the men and the elders and everyone else, the children. And so those are beautiful teachings, and that can come through with cultural specific trauma informed care. And so I'll end there, but thank you.
Thank you very much. And that highlights the need for flexibility. And I don't know if we have enough time, Ms. Timmons, but I wanted for you to address the issue of rural, addressing violence in rural areas. Much of my constituency are rural. Can you speak to that real quickly?
Yes. The needs of rural survivors are quite unique and complicated. And I will try to get some information out to you. I think I ran out of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Please do send that information. I
will. Apologize.
Thank you. No, I know it's an important issue. We look forward to receiving that information. And next, I recognize Representative Thompson from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes for your questions.
Madam Chair, thank you so much. Thank you for this incredibly important hearing, and thank you to all the witnesses who have taken time out of their busy schedules and the great work that you do each and every day serving and protecting vulnerable individuals to be here. Ms. Novarita, thank you for being here today and to discuss an issue that affects 1/3 of all men and women throughout their lives, their domestic violence. Domestic violence has been casted into the background throughout most of our history, sadly keeping it a hidden problem. Survivors of domestic violence have often tolerated physical, mental, emotional abuse in silence out of fear of their spouses or partners would retaliate. Former battered women, civics organizations, and professionals began to open shelters in the 1970s to provide services to abused women and their children. And after seeing the great results from these efforts, Congress led a series of hearings in the early 1980s to understand the scope of this violence and explore possible responses. Now, this led Congress to pass legislation that touched on all facets of domestic abuse, and legislation that we're all very familiar with. Originally passed in 1984, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, or FIPSA, is the primary federal funding source to support emergency shelter and related assistance for victims of domestic violence and their families. And since then, FIPSA has addressed domestic violence through community-driven solutions and a network of programs and services dedicated to responding to domestic violence across the United States, including our U.S. territories. Further, FIPSA funds nearly 1,600 community-based programs through state formula grants, including nearly 60 programs located throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, my home state. These programs provide necessary resources to local communities that help educate individuals on healthy relationships, as well as offer legal assistance, crisis intervention, and counseling. Now, this critical legislation has been authorized 7 times since its enactment, most recently in 2010 for 5 years through fiscal year 2015. Now, I've always supported this program, including introducing legislation in previous years that would offer a clean reauthorization of FIPSA for 5 years. Additionally, supported the CARES Act, which provide $45 million in supplemental funding for FIPSA, formula grantees, and $2 million in supplemental funding for the National Domestic Violence Hotline. The Congress should now focus on ways to support, continue to support pathways to strengthen families to prevent domestic violence and continuing to support survivors despite the added challenges that COVID has posed. Ms. Novarita, you mentioned in your testimony that COVID-19 compounds the struggles faced by survivors of domestic violence, and the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline reports a 15% increase in calls and a 2,000% increase in text messages requesting help. Can you elaborate on how Catholic Charities aided survivors and those seeking help during the pandemic?
Absolutely, absolutely. So most of our referrals come to us from parishes, local hospitals, and community partners, or from other programs and services within Catholic Charities. As a client might come to us for rental assistance, and then when we respond to that need, a relationship begins to take root, trust builds, and then more serious issues, including often domestic violence, come to light. We also receive referrals through our domestic violence helpline and immediately work with the victim on the phone or subsequently in text messages to identify their needs and their options and work with them in the moment to create a safety plan with them. The greatest emergency need that people who call our helpline bring to us is for safe housing away from their abusers. We first see if we can bring them safely into one of our 2 transitional housing programs. We also are integrated into the Chicagoland Greater Network of Service Providers, and we have agreements that did not exist years ago with rideshare companies to transport survivors in crisis to safety 24/7 when they are ready to leave. So those are some of the ways that survivors come to us, and our work is with them. It begins immediately on that first call.
Well, let me just close with saying congratulations. I understand that 100% of the survivor families served by Catholic Charities remain in stable permanent housing, including during COVID. That is quite an accomplishment. And thank you for all that. And thank you to all the witnesses for the work that you do, serving, working to prevent domestic violence and serving the survivors of it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative. And I now recognize Representative Mervin from Indiana for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman. My question is for Amy Novarita. How are you? I'm from Gary, Indiana, so I have the Gary Diocese. So when you speak to the Chicagoland greater area, you're speaking to me because we fall into that category, and it's wonderful to have you here. First, I want to mention to you that as a North Township trustee, I did poor relief assistance. I represented 180,000 people, and I worked very closely with Catholic Charities, specifically on immigration. Candy Torres, who came over from Puerto Rico, I work hand in hand with her. I know she's familiar with what you guys do. And we worked with domestic violence individuals. And I personally have sent through Dr. Miller, we do intake for people who need assistance. And we use the ACE study. And we worked with people, and every case is a snowflake, as you're talking about, right? So my question to you directly, Amy, is can you give an example with a collective impact? So all of you witnesses know what I'm talking about, the collective impact of federal and state government agencies working with you to better a survivor's chances of having a quality of life and better outcomes. Just give me one example where federal and state agencies came together and worked together in a collective impact to help a survivor.
Or I think that what I'd like to highlight as part of in my response here is the transitional housing program that Representative Thompson just mentioned. And housing is, I think, one of the most complex interventions to put into place and to sustain over time. And it absolutely requires blending and braiding public and private funding, as well as a wide network of partnerships. The success of this program that we found at Catholic Charities is threefold. First, we provide transitional housing for up to 2 years. So healing does not happen overnight, and securing the skills and then securing the job to have stable employment, that takes time, and there are going to be challenges along the way. Second, we know that housing alone is insufficient. And so in addition, the women who are in our transitional housing program receive intensive case management services, access to benefits. This includes SNAP, this includes WIC, this often includes Medicaid, and they commit to actively participating in a healing and recovery programming, including weekly classes, some of which are led by folks at Catholic Charities of Chicago, and some of which are from partner organizations. These range from addictions and anger management, financial literacy, budgeting, mindfulness, journaling and reflection, that trauma-informed counseling, English as a second language if needed, particularly with the immigrant community, and job readiness. We also are able to provide on-site childcare if needed. And finally, I think the last piece that cannot go unstated is survivors actively participate in our aftercare program that provides an ongoing support system. They know they can reach out if and when they are struggling and may need extra support. Our support doesn't have an end date. We continue to provide counseling, small group sessions, and food pantry, clothing to help our survivors over the long haul as they hit those bumps in the road.
And I just want to say the partnership that I had as an elected official in my agency to collaborate with those collective impact and those services such as Section 8 housing and access to housing. Those are all things that we work together to make sure people had access to federal programs. I thank you very much. And in closing, I have a question for Ms. Timmons. Very quickly, Ms. Timmons, on my part quickly, we have seen an increase in the rates of physical, intimate partner violence and sexual assault amidst COVID-19 and the pandemic. What characteristics do you think the COVID-19 pandemic have lent, other than isolation, to this increase in violence among domestic partners?
Well, I think isolation plays a key role. I think that just the inherent lack of privacy and lack of support that is that happens with this kind of isolation is a significant piece. Also, the stress. There's we see co-occurring incidents where stress, addiction, alcohol, substance abuse use, and those kinds of things definitely increase incidents of domestic and sexual violence in the family. And I think that has played a significant role.
Thank you to all the witnesses. I appreciate your answers and your time and what you do for victims and survivors.
Thank you. And I now recognize Representative Bowman from New York for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. And thank you all for highlighting the need for trauma-informed schools and trauma-informed education. A big shout out to my colleagues for bringing up that particular issue. You know, my background is education. I worked 20 years in public schools as a teacher, counselor, and middle school principal. And trauma-informed approaches do work. Having more counselors in our schools, having more music programs, having direct instruction in these areas really work very strongly. So thank you all for highlighting that. Dr. Miller, I wanted to ask you, one of the main prevention strategies in the Delta program is engaging influential adults and peers. In your testimony, you referenced the Coaching Boys into Men program and the success the program has had with increasing positive bystander behaviors among middle and high school athletes. Can you please elaborate on the successes of the program, especially around creating a culture of respect and reducing intimate partner violence and sexual assault?
Absolutely. Thank you so very much for asking about this program. And Coaching Boys into Men is just one example of the kind of prevention programs that we can co-create with communities. And you know, the history of this work was recognizing that we needed more adult allies involved in this work. While victim service advocates do phenomenal work in our communities, more people need to be spokespersons for prevention. And wow, coaches are amazing, right? Because they are role models, they're mentors, you know, and in some instances really serve as an adult caregiver role for many of our young people, especially young people in minoritized communities as well. And so what is amazing about the Coaching Boys into Men program is that we ask coaches to spend 10 to 15 minutes a week talking about respectful language, talking about leadership, talking about consent, right? Very, very basic healthy relationship skills, and that is part of being a leader in the school community and on the team. And what is really quite wild is that as athletes hear and discuss amongst themselves, they develop a code word of like, they see a peer engaging in disrespectful behavior, they go, whoa, boys to men, right? And it interrupts that behavior. And so what we have seen with both middle school and high school, again, in very rigorous randomized trials is that at the end of the sports season, these athletes who get exposed to the program are much more likely to speak up and stand up when they see disrespectful behavior. And in fact, one of our local school districts that has probably turned out more NFL players in the country they were early adopters of coaching boys into men. And this is like the one school district where they say the football players are the most respectful in the entire school community. And so it's a joyful program. It's one that very easily athletic coaches are able to adopt. And this is really, the difference between the cost of prevention, which is training victim service advocates, training coaches to do this program that is otherwise free, right? And compared to the cost of one sexual assault, the CDC estimating $123,000 to US society for one sexual assault. The cost for one instance of intimate partner violence, about over 100,000 for women, about 23,000 for men is what the CDC estimates. And so, we can all do the math very quickly. Prevention is a great return on investment.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Mrs. Timmons, research shows that trauma is intergenerational, with mothers transmitting trauma to their children. Children also bear a significant burden in a household where there is intimate partner violence and may suffer significant trauma in their own right. If we do not break the cycle of violence and trauma, how much do children stand to lose from the proliferation of domestic violence?
That's an awesome question. Thank you. I think that one of the most devastating impacts of a 30-year career in domestic violence is seeing the impact on kids of domestic and sexual violence. And children stand to lose a significant portion of their future when they're impacted by those. Our whole selves, as I've said earlier, is impacted. I can't overemphasize how holistic and inclusive and complicated trauma impacts us as humans. And so I just would say that children have a significant amount to lose if we don't intervene and in the cycle of violence.
So when we talk about a public health holistic approach, we're talking about education, K-12 systems, we're talking about housing, we're talking about healthcare system, preventive measures in the community, and measures to support those who have been victims with emergency housing and other services. Thank you all for that. That was amazing. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. And now I recognize the chair of the full committee, Representative Scott from Virginia, for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Navarrete, you mentioned positive parenting. Exactly what does that mean and why is it important?
Thank you for your question. And my father is going to be grateful that the name Novarita is getting so much play today. I think that positive parenting, which is a really critical and important aspect of the work that we're discussing today, was brought up by Dr. Miller. And so I actually would love to ask Dr. Miller to comment further on that.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So the term positive parenting encompasses a number of different supports for parents. And I want to begin by the first part is recognizing that for many parents, including adolescents who are pregnant and parenting, that they may not have always been exposed to healthy and respectful environments. And in fact, we know for adolescents who are pregnant and parenting that far too often it was also in the context of unhealthy and environments. And so exposure to violence is part of the story. That we earlier heard about the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study as well. So we all recognize, as Ms. Timmons was saying, that the intergenerational impact of exposure to violence it can impact the way in which one parents. What is so vital, however, is that as we approach and work with parents as a pediatrician, I both acknowledge that sometimes number one, parenting is hard. Number two, parenting is extra hard for parents for whom they may have had prior exposure to violence and that they may have been harmed as children. And the third is to say that they are not alone. This, in a pediatrician's office, to be able to say there is no shame, no judgment here. I'm offering information to all of the parents because I recognize that sometimes parenting is hard. And here are opportunities for parenting programs and support. Yes.
It's essentially positive parenting using positive reinforcement as a strategy to change behavior rather than slapping the child.
Absolutely, but also recognizing the parents too need support. And so they need to be given the supports around mindfulness and wellness and recognizing that parent mental health is vitally important to the health and wellness of their children as well. So it is absolutely around identifying strategies to support your child's developing behaviors that does not involve corporal punishment, while simultaneously recognizing that parents often need more supports and services.
Thank you. Vice Chair Shalita, are there complications in the criminal justice system that make it difficult to hold Native Americans who are guilty of violence accountable in the criminal justice system?
Yes, currently there are many challenges, Congressman Scott. One of them is, non-native perpetrators on Indian lands. And I'll send you something in writing. I'll answer that in writing. Thank you.
Okay, does this bill do anything about it?
What this bill will do, if the proposed enhancements are granted, it will give survivors, victims, and access to heal and get those resources. But in regards to holding perpetrators accountable on our land for their actions, that I think falls outside of FIPSA's funding, but kind of goes into Department of Justice. But if there are some considerations and measures and additional funds, we would gladly take it.
And it probably wouldn't be within our jurisdiction. It'd probably be in the Judiciary Committee. But I know when I was on the Judiciary Committee, we had some problems. You mentioned hotlines. How effective are they?
They are actually a lifeline. We've noticed an uptick in calls to the Native Hotline. So we've also noticed on the national hotline, as they're parenting the Strong Hearts Native Helpline currently, that a lot of Native callers will call in, but if they don't get connected to the Native hotline prior to them going 24/7, they would wait till they can talk to a Native advocate on the hotline. And so the Native hotline is gathering a lot of tribal resources and data that are specific to the survivors that can get connected to their lifelines back under tribal nations.
Thank you, Madam Chair, you're back.
Thank you, Chairman Scott. I now recognize Representative McBath from Georgia for 5 minutes for your questions.
No, thank you so much, Madam Chair, and to all of the subcommittee members. Thank you so much for having this important hearing today and allowing me to take part in it. And I want to thank all of our witnesses today for sharing their expertise and insight. And just thank you so much for all the preventive measures that you take to protect women and families. Since it was first authorized in 1984, I'm so sorry, and I just lost my remarks for a second. Hold on. Oh, goodness. Hold on. I knew that was going to happen. It's been happening all day. Okay, since it was first authorized in 1984, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act was provided the resources and funding necessary for shelters and organizations to help survivors of domestic and dating violence. And in that time, however, we've learned, there are far better methods for prevention and support. And that's why last Congress, I introduced the Family Violence Prevention and Services Improvement Act, FIPSA, with Representatives Gwen Moore, Tom Cole, and John Katko. And I look forward to reintroducing this legislation again this week in order to provide more equitable resources and access to funding for all communities. Madam Chair, I think we've already done so. We'd like to enter into the record a letter of support we've already provided that's been signed by 19 organizations stating their support for the FIPS Improvement Act of 2019 and their desire for the passage of the comprehensive FIPS legislation during this Congress.
Without objection.
Thank you. As the new and improved methods of prevention have been discovered over the years, so too has the link between intimate partner violence and gun violence. According to the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence, about 4.5 million women in the United States have been threatened with a gun, and nearly 1 million women have been shot or shot at by an intimate partner. Women are also 5 times more likely to be murdered when their abuser has access to firearms. And in my home state of Georgia, 73% of reported domestic violence related deaths were committed by firearms in 2019 alone. Dr. Miller, my questions are for you. Could you please speak to how these efforts to reduce gun violence and murder are such an intrinsic part of a comprehensive plan to prevent intimate partner violence?
Absolutely. And I want to begin first by saying, Representative McBeth, thank you so much for your leadership on this issue, knowing that it is deeply personal for you. And I'm just incredibly grateful for your lifting up the intersections of different forms of violence. So we know, right, that intimate partner violence is inextricably linked with gun violence and violent loss in our communities. And when I talk about violence prevention, we were talking about trauma-sensitive school practices, for example, or positive parenting strategies, ways to create safe and supportive environments. Those kinds of cross-cutting violence prevention strategies where we bring in our faith-based organizations, our healthcare systems, our community organizations, those cross-cutting prevention will also reduce gun violence and murder. And that is why the CDC has invested so much in prevention around influential adults and peers, safe and supportive environments, as well as economic supports for our families, because we know that's what is needed to create safer communities. But certainly as a pediatrician and somebody currently working in schools, I also want to lift up what Representative Bowman was identifying as a former middle school teacher. We currently are in the midst of this pandemic doing work virtually with young people who have been exposed to violence in our middle schools here in Pittsburgh. Over 60% of the young people in our research study have experienced violent loss. That means losing a friend or loved one to murder. It is extraordinary exposure to violence that our young people are facing, and those of us who are on this call together have an obligation to work together to end gun violence and to end intimate partner violence. So I'm grateful to you for that question.
Well, absolutely. Thank you so much. And Dr. Miller, I know that you've also done some research on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on intimate partner violence. Can you share some of what you learned about how prepared service providers were for the pandemic and what needs to be done moving forward to ensure that intimate partner violence providers are prepared for any future emergencies such as COVID-19?
Absolutely, thank you. So I have had the immense privilege of working with the CDC and the American Academy of Pediatrics in Futures Without Violence on a project interviewing intimate partner violence victim service advocates, as well as child welfare workers and administrators, domestic violence coalitions across the country to understand how they have responded to this pandemic. And I have to say, I mean, victim service advocates were my heroes long before the pandemic. They certainly taught me everything I know about how to manage and support survivors. But they have been like way up there in triple gold stars now, because what they have accomplished with almost nothing in terms of resources has been extraordinary. Incredibly nimble ways of supporting survivors. Ms. Novarita earlier was talking about the importance of privacy. We have heard from advocates who have have figured out all kinds of clever solutions for interacting with survivors in ways that support their privacy and safety. And what we are learning is that we were woefully unprepared for this. And we can do so much better, because it turns out that even in my city of Pittsburgh, intimate partner violence, child abuse was not part of our emergency preparedness plan. That's changing, right? Because moving and coming out of this pandemic, we recognize that victim services have to be much more robust. We have to be able to much more nimbly respond, because suddenly, congregate living in shelter was not a safe option.
Right.
So
Thank you so much for your answers.
You yield back. Thank you. We do have another member joining us, Representative Sparks from Indiana. I recognize you for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it's an important conversation. And I think it's, pandemic puts a lot of different things, to a different perspective, and really kind of brought to our attention. What I want to ask Ms. Novarita, what do you believe how we can do better job to individualize services to meet family needs and survivors where they are, to make sure that we have more on the ground tailored services? If you have any ideas and could share with us.
Sure, absolutely. So this healing journey is a very long process with many ups and downs. Every survivor's experience has been different, so everybody's journey is going to be different as well. Many victims who come to us are not yet prepared to safely exit their situation. We do know that on average, the average survivor leaves their abuser 7 times before they safely, fully leave. So the work that we do at charities, and so many of the other organizations that are being lifted up today helps each person to create a plan to stay safe, understand their options, and know that they are not alone. It may take years, but we are right there with survivors, accompanying them in their journey. Meeting victims of domestic violence where they are can mean meeting them in houses of worship. In preparation for today's discussion, one of our counselors shared with me the experience of a woman who had been experiencing domestic violence for many years. She and her 10-year-old son came to church regularly, and one Sunday in the homily, a speaker who was there on behalf of Catholic Charities gave a sermon about domestic violence, stating that the church does not condone staying in a violent marriage, and shared where to seek help. This woman reached out to Catholic Charities, and she shared with our counselor, who I spoke with in preparation for today, that her 10-year-old son sparked that outreach. He told his mom as they left service that day, hey, he was talking about you. He was talking about us. We have so many different clients who come to us in so many different situations and at different points on their journey. We had one client recently who called because her physically abusive boyfriend is being released from jail. She has no support, she is unemployed, and he is returning home. She's single, so her options currently for shelters are quite limited. We stayed on the phone with her and helped her create a safety plan in that moment, and worked with her to secure transportation and a placement at an emergency shelter the next day. Another client called us recently for counseling. She has an order of protection and 2 children. She is employed and wants to remain in her apartment. And we are providing counseling for her and her children, and helping her to go to court to amend her order of protection, creating that safety plan, and providing her with the linkages that she needs to food, to legal services, to kind of the whole gamut. So I think to your question and kind of the need to tailor services, those are 3 specific examples of women who have come to us at different points in their journey in very different life situations. And really the expertise of the folks on the ground who we get to lift up today is essential to provide that trauma-informed and client-centered support, in accompaniment along the journey.
Just quickly to follow up, could you share some best practices? It seems to me it would take collaboration of a lot of different groups and entities, and sometimes it's very fragmented, different things and services. Could you share some best practices you've seen of great collaboration of different organizations on the ground?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that's happening in Illinois right now, which is really exciting, is a new alliance began actually in the midst of COVID, and it's called the Alliance for Shared Safety. And what the Alliance for Shared Safety is doing is it's bringing together advocates and organizations in different spaces. So bringing together folks from gun violence spaces, from domestic violence, doing criminal justice system reform, and folks who are kind of experiencing community violence. I think one of the things that's really powerful with that collaboration is recognizing the intersectionality of the issues, and they were successful. We were successful in Illinois earlier in 2020 in bringing federal dollars and some CARES dollars in a more integrated fashion directly to organizations serving victims of violence. So I think that's a really exciting collaboration to keep an eye on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you very much. That was a very meaningful testimony from all of our witnesses today. Now we're going to material submitted for the hearing record. I remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, materials for submission for the hearing record must be submitted to the committee clerk within 14 days following the last day of the hearing, so by close of business on April 5th, 2021, preferably in Microsoft Word format. Only a member of the subcommittee or an invited witness may submit materials for inclusion in the hearing record. Documents are limited to 50 pages each. Documents longer than 50 pages will be incorporated into the record via an internet link that you must provide to the committee clerk within the required time frame, but please recognize that in the future that link may no longer work. And at this time, because Representative McBath is on the full committee but not on the subcommittee, I offer for inclusion into the record the materials that Representative McBath offered in support of the policy we're discussing today, and those will be admitted without objection. Pursuant to House rules and regulations, items for the record should be submitted to the clerk electronically by emailing submissions to ed&labor.hearings@mail.house.gov. Member offices are encouraged to submit materials to the inbox before the hearing or during the hearing at the time the member makes the request. Again, I want to thank each of our witnesses for your participation today. Members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for you. We ask you to please respond to those questions in writing. The hearing record will be held open for 14 days in order to receive those responses. And I remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, witness questions for the hearing record must be submitted to the majority committee staff or committee clerk within 7 days. The questions submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing. And I now recognize a distinguished ranking member, Ranking Member Fulcher, for a closing statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To those who provided testimony today, this is one of those topics that is it's extremely necessary to have a conversation on, but I'll just tell you personally, for me, it's one of the most difficult. Put me down in front of a tax policy, infrastructure, or foreign policy, or resources, and I'm good to go. This one, it hits you where you live really quick. So thank you for what you do. You've got a skill set and a knowledge base that I'm not as blessed with, but I know how important it is. And Madam Chair, we probably agree on more of these things than we do on some of these other meetings today, but we know this is a problem. We know it's a significant problem. We know that women are extremely vulnerable with this. Multiple approaches are very necessary. And notably, since 1984, the Family Violence Prevention Service Acts provided some vital support for survivors and families to state and local providers. And most recently, Congress has included additional support over the past year to respond to problems that have risen due to COVID. But just the high points that I wanted to reiterate was the local involvement is just so important. And I heard that those who provided testimony affirmed that, again, in areas that I don't have high expertise, but I heavily suspect that there's a lot of things that are common denominators that have to be addressed that are very similar across the board. There's also things that are going to be different from place to place. And my hometown of Meridian and Boise is probably a little bit different than Chicago. I mean, I can tell you it's a lot different than Chicago, but in terms of these issues, there's probably some different approaches that are needed in the local, that personal touch that you can do locally has got to be supported. I am a huge fan of faith-based involvement with this issue with civic groups. It adds to that local side, and I think Ms. Navarrete, you articulated why that is very well positioned to deal with these types of things. There's just some things that we can't do in government. There's some things we can't do from Washington, D.C. But Madam Chair, that's my closing comment to Ms. Navarrete, Dr. Miller, and Ms. Schneider, and Ms. Timmons. Thank you for who you are, what you do. You're appreciated. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. And I now recognize myself for the purpose of making a closing statement. I want to again thank our witnesses for guiding us through today's hearing. You each brought a particular expertise and answered our questions in a very meaningful way. Intimate partner violence is a public health threat that we cannot ignore. I'm glad this has been a bipartisan conversation, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to address this issue. And I especially, of course, we need the investment, and we also need to have that investment in prevention. The increased rates of domestic violence during the pandemic have brought renewed attention to the urgent need to expand equitable strategies that prevent intimate partner violence and save lives. But let's be clear, this crisis is about much more than what's happened over just the past year. It's about the countless survivors across the country who for years have lived each day with the trauma of intimate partner violence. For the health of our constituents and our communities, we must do everything we can to support survivors and eradicate intimate partner violence whenever and wherever it occurs. I am, again, committed to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to take meaningful, evidence-based action to provide survivors with the support that they need and to prevent intimate partner violence from happening in the first place. I want to close by again encouraging anyone who needs support or help to visit www.thehotline.org or call 1-800-799-SAFE-SAFE. If there is no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you again.